And so we move on. My plan was to be back today, but however, as you can tell, that did not happen. So we will continue on to now that we have talked about the articles and some of their shortcomings and sort of the constitutional convention and sort of the need for a new way for this new country to govern itself. And then you all begin to outline um, some of the basic principles uh, there in your assignment from yesterday. We now will turn our attention to the actual Constitution itself. And as you can tell, this is a lecture that I put together for my government classes that I teach to my seniors. Now, the information that we're going to be talking about will be similar to the information that you'll get when you have me in government. Although this is much more of a basic introduction, uh, we won't head nearly into as much depth, but we do certainly need to do some justice here to the actual Constitution. You'll have a link to the Pear Deck notes, hopefully posted there in Classroom. That will be on student pace mode. So as always, make sure that you're following along and that you are on the correct slide. I am checking these takeaways, and I will be checking these takeaways for completion points. Um, and once again, I'm going to try to keep this at about 20 to 25 minutes, um, and hopefully we can make some good. We can continue to make some headway in my absence. So, with all of that said, we will now jump into the Constitution. So you have a very basic outline of the Constitution there, and it bears mentioning a couple of things right off the bat. So this is if you were to outline sort of like what you did yesterday. If you were to sit down and outline the Constitution, these would be sort of your large um, large headings, right? There is the preamble that just sort of outlines the basic tenets of the Constitution, and then there are 7 articles that do some incredibly specific things. Now, these articles, they are the ways in which the government is given power. Okay, they are not laws. Okay, and that's a very tricky distinction to make because after these 7 articles, we then find a list of 27 amendments, right? And those amendments are more specific principles that allow for the creation of smaller laws. And again, we're not going to get into the particulars of the minutia of the difference between an amendment and an article and a law too terribly much, except for to know that the articles are what give government power. Amendments provide sort of the bones of our government. And then the laws that are passed by Congress, signed into law, or the bills that are passed by Congress, signed into law by the president, they sort of provide the flesh on the body. That's an analogy that I have sort of used and reused, as the case is, to sort of think about amendments and laws. Articles then are just sort of the framework under which we are operating. And as you can see there, after the preamble, it's very specific. Article 1 creates the legislative. Article 2 creates the executive. Article 3 creates the judicial branches. There's then specific issues relating to different interactions between the various states in the Union. There's ways to amend or change the Constitution. There's a process that's laid out. There are then obviously you have to deal with the ability to pay and incur debt if need be, national law, all that, before finally you get into ratifying the Constitution, which just means for it to take effect. So that's just sort of our basic outline. Now, as we move into just some sort of basics, and again, this changes a little bit in terms of with the passage of time, right? So I had to update this because I hadn't updated it since I put this together a few years ago. But this document is now 232 years old. Okay, so when I say that things change, I simply mean that the passage of time. It does bear mentioning, though, and you see that there in this fourth bullet point, that it is a living document. It can and it does change to suit the times. Now, as we will even find here in just sort of our very brief introduction to the Constitution, we'll find that the Constitution is difficult to change, and that's done on purpose. The Founding Fathers do that in a very purposeful way. They want a document that is living because they recognize that, as it says there, this is the supreme law of the land. It sets up the federal government. But with the passage of time, 232 years, things are going to change, and the government is going to need to change to fit those new needs. But at the same time, you also don't want to make it so easy to change that it's just done flippantly. It's just done, it's changed simply for change's sake. So the Founding Fathers had to really find a tricky balance there. And obviously, they've done at least a passable job. I mean, it's over 230 years old. Countless countries have modeled either on their own will and volition or by being forced to model their constitutions after ours. So there is some degree of success, and that depends on who you talk to, obviously, as to how successful it is. But it cannot be denied that the American Constitution has been met with some success, at least on some level. Now, we're going to look, depending on the amount of time that I have here, we're at least going to look at the 6 basic principles that the Constitution is based on. And then at that point, when we get through those 6, I will check where we're at on time considerations, and we may stop there. Or if we're still doing good on time, again, I want to keep it somewhere around 30 minutes. We may continue on. So we're just going to kind of play it by ear here. Now, the first basic principle is what's called popular sovereignty. And you can see there that first bullet point is a great, just very, very quick and easy surface level definition of popular sovereignty, right? And that is that the people are the only source of governmental power. Now, again, you will not have had this exposure, but in government, when you have me in government class, when you guys are seniors, we'll talk about sort of different theories of government, right? About how different governments come to power. And one of those would be, for example, the divine right of kings, that, God, a deity gives certain men power to rule. That's not what this is based on. This is based on popular sovereignty. The people are the source of the power, not God, not your surroundings, which is another way that power is in some cultures delineated is based on your surroundings. Here, it's the people, right? And this is obviously done through voting and things like that. Now, again, this changes over time. And you've got the example there of the presidential election process. We're not really going to get into why do we still use the Electoral College right now. That's something that we may talk about when I get back, because the Electoral College is one of those things that is and can be quite complicated. And it's kind of difficult to explain if you can't really sort of parse out these various issues and sort of get your guys' reactions and things like that. But suffice it to say that we have not always used the Electoral College to decide who is the president, right? And there have even been calls, obviously, to eliminate the Electoral College. And that could happen, right? Because the government can change. And there's a big push after the 2016 election to get rid of the Electoral College. That's something that could happen. Will it? It's possible. I don't know that it does with any immediacy, but we'll see. But anyway, the principle is that if the people dictate, if the people mandate, we need to get rid of the Electoral College, then we would get rid of the Electoral College. Now, as it stands right now, that has not happened yet, but it could very easily. Now, limited government. This is where that basic outline is so important, right? Because you can see very specifically that the founding fathers are laying out these three branches of government, right? And the reason that they are so specific is that they want the government to be limited. They only want the government to do what the people allow it to, right? And again, like it says there at the second bullet point, that's something that I always try to point out is that, look, any complaint that could be levied about a specific law, at some point, somebody supported that. And if not somebody, at least, if not a majority, certainly a significant portion of the population supported that change or supported that policy. Now, as with anything else, there is room for corruption. This is obviously an ideal way that this works, and it doesn't always work out, but that's sort of the idea. The other analogy that I make, or the other point that I make with my government students, is that when we talk about government, we talk about government in terms of a car, right? This is the way the car is supposed to run. This is the way that the car is supposed to work. That doesn't mean that it always works that way, right? Cars break down sometimes. Cars will have engine trouble sometimes. So, for every single one of these things, it would be very easy for someone to say, well, but that's not how this works. You could very easily be right. Sometimes the system breaks down, right? And when it does, there are mechanisms by which you could fix them. So that's just something that's important to point out here. Government officials are not above the law. That is what's called the rule of law. It just means that the law applies to everyone equally. Once again, see the car analogy. It's very popular to say, well, but the law is not fair for everyone. And historically, that is absolutely 100% correct. It's the way that it's supposed to work. It's not the way that it always works. And change does take time, right? And you can talk about prohibition, for example, and it's repealed the 18th Amendment. There were enough people that believed, hey, we need to get rid of alcohol completely. And then after doing some quick math, I think it's 14 years. After somewhere around 10 to 14 years, enough people said that was a terrible idea, and they repealed it. So, change does take time, but the government does respond, right? Now, the separation of powers, and this is again where we go back to that outline. The three powers are separated among different groups, right? So, and this is one of those things that it's very difficult to parse this out very, very quickly. But there are three main powers. There's legislative, there's executive, and there's judicial. Legislative is the lawmaking power. Executive is executing the law. And then judicial is obviously making judgment based on the law. In other systems, and again, we're not trying to do comparative government here, but in other systems, you would have that power concentrated, right, in one, maybe two different places. With our system of government, we have separated those powers into three distinct groups. And the reason is to sort of, I don't want to say weaken each group, but to try to keep each group uh, sort of contained. The founding fathers did not want any one person or group to get too much power, and one of the quickest ways to do that is to separate them, right? And so the Congress is vested with the legislative, the president is vested with the executive. Um, and again, it's not just the president. The president is merely the chief executive. Um, and then the Supreme Court obviously is the head of the judicial branch. Um, so, and again, it's all designed to help limit the power of the federal government. You see the James Madison quote there. So it's also based on separation of powers. Next, then, is checks and balances. And this checks and balances ideal. It only is allowed by the separation of powers. If you did not have the separation of powers, there would be no need for checks and balances. And again, the idea here is we've separated power. Now we want to keep one branch or one group from gaining too much power. Now, again, as it says there, this changes over time, right? And it talks about the power of the president. Presidential power has expanded and contracted. Contract just means to get smaller several times over the course of our country's history. And really, even just in the last 130 years or so, presidential power just continues to sort of go back and forth. Same way with Congress, right? And it all depends on a variety of different factors, right? Sort of the will of the people, the strength of leadership, the nature of just sort of partisan politics in general, which, perhaps the greatest founding father of all, George Washington, warned against partisan politics, but that's a different lecture for a different time. The one branch that is designed specifically to be what we call apolitical, which means it is not a political body, is the judicial branch. It is designed to be completely and totally impartial, or at least as impartial as possible. Supreme Court justices, for example, are not to be engaged with political parties or actively engaged with political parties. Most of them typically have some activity from before they were Supreme Court justices that is of a political nature, but they're certainly not to be active participants in the political process because they're supposed to be impartial. Now, because the executive and the legislative branches can and are political bodies, their relationship can sometimes get very tense and very tenuous. Obviously, you can just look around at our current political climate and see that. So, again, this is how the car is designed to work. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it can be a little bit restricting because of the sort of political gridlock that we are experiencing right now, for example. But again, this is how the system is designed to work. Judicial review, which I think is the last of our six. The Supreme Court, again, is supposed to be apolitical. It is often not. Many times you will hear you will hear pundits talk about liberal justices or conservative justices, and there's a general consensus or a general idea of okay, well, this justice is a more based on their background, they're a more conservative justice, or more liberal or what have you. So it's designed to be apolitical, but it's not always. The core function of the course of the court rather, is not to determine guilt or innocence. That is the Supreme Court. So we tend to think in terms of like your police dramas and things like that. That well, the court system, that their whole their whole job is to determine whether or not a person is guilty or innocent. That's not the function of the Supreme Court. Um, the function of the Supreme Court is to determine what is called constitutionality, and that's basically, is a government action uh, right, or does it violate the basic tenets of the Constitution? Right. That is the power of judicial review. Again, we're not going to get super into this right now, although we will talk about judicial review actually fairly shortly. I think we'll get to judicial review uh, before too long. But right now, we don't want to get too deep into the weeds on this. So there's sort of your judicial review. Now, federalism. I guess this isn't. I guess judicial review was not the last one. Federalism. This describes the relationship between the central government and the regional governments, right? Now, here we're talking about whether the central government or whether the regional governments have more power, right? And this is a good point to sort of draw a comparison back to the Articles of Confederation, right? So, with the Articles of Confederation, we had what was called a federal government, which means that the regional governments, which in our system we call states, the regional governments are the ones that have all the power, right? And the central government has only the powers that those regional governments give it, right? Now, with and the third type escapes me. Federalism is the mix of the two. Wow, I totally blanked on that. There is a third. There is a second or a third, depending on how you number it, type where the central government has all the power and the regional governments they only have the power that the central government allows it to have. Federalism then sort of exists in between the two, right? Where there are certain powers that the central government has, there are certain powers that the regional governments have, and then there are certain powers that are shared, right? And the analogy that you have there is an apartment complex. So you will have, and I'm surrounded by hotels and these high rises. And I'm sure that there are apartment complexes just a couple of blocks here from where I'm at right now. But you have sort of the apartment as a whole that has its rules, that has its regulations, that has its laws, you might say. But then within the apartment complex, you have obviously the different rooms, and you have families that are living in those rooms, and those families have their own rules. Now, the rules that those families have within their individual apartments cannot exist in contrast or cannot counter the rules of the apartment complex. But they can make their own sort of rules about, conduct and behavior and things like that. So the apartment complex is actually a really good, analogy for what we're talking about here with federalism. And so then you get into power, right? And I think this is actually where we will stop. We're going to go over this and then we'll stop for this lecture. All this is just a list of all of these different things that governments have power, but we have to be specific about which kind of government, right? Or which government really? Is it the regional? Is it the state government? Is it the central government that is sort of the federal government? Or is it what we call a shared power, right? So maintaining an army and a navy, right? Today, we understand that as a uniquely federal power. There is no Indiana Marine Corps or Indiana Navy, right? Um, there is only the United States Navy. There is the United States Army, right? So that one is specifically, and we intuitively know this. You probably don't even think about it too much. Um, that is a federal power, right? However, if we jump back to the context of the 1780s when the Constitution was written, and we talked about this when we talked about the Articles of Confederation, the regional governments were the ones that maintained armies and navies, right? So this was a drastic shift, right? And again, it changes over time because the militia system was still allowed to exist, at least for a little while. But this is pretty radical change, right? Borrowing money. Now, this is one that is shared. Both the federal government and state governments can borrow money, right? On behalf of the citizens of the nation or of the state. Building infrastructure is also a shared power. Coining money, this is one that is just a federal power. Imagine the chaos, and we saw this in the article. We didn't really talk specifically about it. We saw this in the article. So imagine the chaos of, and this is not too hard to imagine because we live so close to Illinois. Imagine trying to go grocery shopping in Illinois but not being able to pay with the currency that you use in Indiana, right? But having to convert that currency, right? So the power to coin money and to give money its value is something that's just vested in the federal government. Establishing schools is actually strictly a state power. That is one that just goes to the states. The federal government can provide funding, but they cannot um, establish schools, which is something that's very interesting. The regulation of marriage, right now, the regulation of marriage is a state by state issue. Excuse me. Again, that is something that right now there are a lot of people that want to change that. There's a movement right now to change that. And, a lot of these things will end up being heard at various points by the Supreme Court. Um, and a lot of times, and I ran into this with my government class, a lot of times individual states will actually pass laws on purpose that are so radical and that are so extreme. And in a lot of cases that are outright defiant of national law just because they want to raise, just because they want guidance, they want clarification. Um, so the regulation of marriages, and then the conducting elections is actually a strictly state matter, right? Only the states can conduct elections. Now, we obviously have national elections, but the states are the ones that govern all the different requirements for, uh, how to register, for where do you go to vote. That's all determined by the states. So I think I'm going to stop there because I think this will be a really good point to pick up when I come back, where we can sort of start with that column that's on the right, and just take a quick glance at those. I think there's seven. There's seven different things. Take a glance at those and kind of think a little bit about which one is it? Is it a state? Is it a federal? Or is it a shared power? Give a little bit of thought to that, and we'll pick up with that when I see you guys next. So with that, I will hopefully see you shortly.